What's up everyone, you're about Pesh Kumar here and welcome back to Boeing Boy and welcome back to something that you all love, and that is Cockpit Stories. Today's Cockpit story is going to be about this. Can you imagine flying an aircraft in this state and still safely landing the aircraft? Today we'll find out what happened on Aloha Airlines flight 243 and how did this Boeing 737 end up like this. So Aloha Airlines is an airline which is based out of Hawaii. Now as you all know, Hawaii are very small tiny islands, and Aloha Airlines would operate flights that would go from one island to another island. As a result, very short flights with very little flying time. Aloha Airlines flight 243 took off from a small little island called Hilo, and the flight was going to Honolulu. Now the aircraft which was under operation was a Boeing 737-200. And this was amongst the first few Boeing 737s ever built in 1969. So as you can imagine, on the date of the incident, the aircraft was already about 21 years old, and the funny part is the aircraft had done over 90,000 flight cycles. Now a flight cycle is basically when the aircraft takes off and lands at an airport. That is one flight cycle. Now, how is this relevant? Well, all the aircrafts that we fly on, the commercial aircrafts, they are all pressurized aircrafts, which means the cabin in which we sit and the cockpit and a few other parts of the aircraft are all pressurized. Because obviously the air outside at high altitudes is not breathable, there's not enough oxygen. So the aircrafts have to be pressurized. Now a pressurized aircraft is like a balloon. Balloon में हवा भर दो तो it becomes bigger, हवा निकाल दो तो it becomes smaller. Exactly the same thing happens with an aircraft. When you go to a high altitude and the aircraft is pressurized, it's like having a balloon with air filled inside of it. And as a result, the fuselage of the aircraft actually expands. The body is actually bigger at high altitudes. When the aircraft comes in for a landing, the pressure outside and inside is equalized and the body shrinks back to its original size. Now this, as you can imagine, will create a certain amount of fatigue and stress on the body of the aircraft. So like I said, the aircraft which had the incident had 90,000 flight cycles. So it had taken off and landed 90,000 times, which is a lot. And that was at that time amongst the oldest Boeing 737s still flying. Funny thing is, the aircraft only had about 35,000 hours on the airframe, which means on an average, each flight that the aircraft operated was actually even less than half an hour. Now that is obviously because Hawaii Islands are just tiny little islands and the aircraft just used to hop between the islands. However, due to continuous pressurization cycles, the body of the aircraft, the structure of the aircraft had become fatigued and it had actually developed cracks. So when the flight took off and reached its cruising altitude of only 24,000 feet, everything was normal till then. However, suddenly, almost an 18 feet long piece of the fuselage literally just broke off and flew away. This happened because there was a crack which had been developing, and that crack eventually gave up when the aircraft became pressurized, resulting in a huge explosive decompression, which resulted in an aircraft which almost had a huge sunroof. Now, whenever you have an explosive decompression, air which is pressurized inside the aircraft will escape out of the aircraft suddenly, because outside pressure is low, pressure inside the aircraft is higher. And that is exactly what happened, which resulted in one of the flight attendants being just sucked out into the atmosphere. However, luckily, all the passengers who were seated on those front rows of the aircraft, they all had their seatbelts on, and luckily they were not pulled out into the sky. At the time of the incident, the first officer was flying the aircraft, and it has been reported that when the first officer looked back and saw what's happening, she could literally see the blue sky from the cockpit, because right from behind the cockpit till 18 feet of seats, the roof had just blown off. Imagine sitting in the cockpit, looking behind, and what you see is clear blue sky and passengers just being hurled by very strong winds. At this point, the captain took over controls and they initiated something known as an emergency descent. Now, an emergency descent is the aircraft descends down very fast to get down to a safer altitude, because even at 24,000 feet, the air is not sufficient for humans to survive. There's not enough oxygen. So we normally descend down to below 10,000 feet. That is what the captain did, and eventually they diverted and they landed at an airport. Everyone's safe except that one flight attendant who was unfortunately sucked out. Luckily enough, the remainder of the aircraft was still structurally okay, and the lower part of the aircraft held the whole aircraft together, and the aircraft did manage a safe landing. Both the pilots, who were highly experienced and they had a lot of hours on the Boeing 737, did a very great job of getting everyone down safely, because it is actually really tough. An emergency descent is a very complicated maneuver. It's a very dynamic situation, and with half of your aircraft blown off, it just becomes all the more dramatic. Just imagine winds of about 300-400 kilometers per hour blowing all around you because the aircraft's broken, and you still have to fly that aircraft down and make sure everyone remains safe. So a big kudos and hats off to the two pilots who did a great job. Also, very interestingly, one of the passengers later, after the incident, told that they actually saw a crack on the fuselage before boarding the aircraft. Unfortunately, that particular passenger did not inform anyone about that crack, otherwise maybe the flight attendant's life could have been saved. Now, it has also been reported at a few places that on the approach, one of the engines, the left engine, also failed. I'm not really sure if that happened or not, but if it did, it just adds to your already big enough problem. During the investigation, it was found out that the maintenance which was being conducted on the aircraft by Aloha Airlines was not sufficient. They were not taking good enough care of their aircrafts, which resulted in this incident, and that crack just being left unnoticed and not being caught by anyone. And that is how Aloha Airlines Flight 243 did the most dramatic sort of emergency descent and landing. Luckily, all the passengers were safe. Unfortunately, one flight attendant lost her life. Unfortunately, even more, her body was never found. Also, the broken part of the roof of the aircraft was also never found. It must have fallen down somewhere in the sea, and no one bothered enough to trace it. And that's about it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed the story. I will be coming out with more cockpit stories. Probably I'll come out with one tomorrow. So I'll see you guys tomorrow. Thank you so much for watching, and this is your boy Tapesh Kumar signing off.
Aloha 243, we're in dock for landing. Descending out of 13, and we have rapid descent. We are pressurized, declaring an emergency.
Hello, 243, clear your position.
Pressurized into Maui for landing. Request the equipment.
243, the equipment is on the roll. Plans straight in runway 2, and I'll keep you advised on any wind change.
We're going to need assistance. We cannot communicate with the flight attendant. We'll need assistance for the passengers when we land.
Okay, I understand you're going to need an ambulance, is that correct?
Affirmative.
Hello, 243, can you give me your souls on board and your fuel on board?
We, 86 plus 5 crew members.
Roger, how many do you think are injured?
We have no idea. We cannot communicate with our flight attendants.
Okay, we'll have ambulance on the way.